now I wouldn't say that NATO is set in stone. With a highly emotional and unpredictable agent of chaos leading the United States, anything could be on the table like in an hour's time.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Igor Novikov, former advisor to Zelensky. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Russia, Ukraine and the US are expected to meet in Abu Dhabi today for trilateral talks. This makes it the first meeting by all three countries since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine nearly 4 years ago. What do you expect to be discussed today and how do you expect it to go?
Well, this kind of particular format, that's not actually the first time it's being utilized. And I'm pleased that the talks have resumed because there was a major pause and, the aggressor state, Russia, they've even stopped the prisoner of war exchanges to put pressure on Ukraine. So I'm glad that at least some conversations are happening. Now, what my expectations are, that pretty much depends on the root cause of this. Because let me remind everyone that this war only stops if the aggressor stops, or if we put enough pressure on the aggressor to stop. So it's all down to Russia.
And yesterday, when Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy, was going to Moscow to have talks with Russia, he was saying that a lot of progress had been made with these talks, but it all boiled down to one issue. And then we also heard from an aide to Putin who spoke after these talks with the US. He said the talks were constructive, but they added that it reiterated that without resolving the territorial issue according to the formula agreed upon in Anchorage, there is no hope of achieving a long-term settlement. What does that suggest to you, and what does that suggest about how these talks today are going to go?
Well, the infamous Anchorage formula, I think that's the Russian smokescreen. So there was no agreement per se reached in Anchorage. So that's a way of hiding behind, terms to try and get more out of this negotiation. So what I really think it boils down to is the format that's found to settle, the territorial, quote unquote, side of things. But once again, that all depends on what Russia's underlying intent is. If they're serious about peace, I'm pretty sure a solution could be found. If it's just another Russian delay tactic, and unfortunately and tragically, I'm in Kiev now and we're seeing that the real goal is to use everything in their power, including the power of nature, freezing temperatures and the lack of electricity and heat of their making to put enough pressure on Ukraine to get more of Ukraine. So if Putin is prepared to stop where he's at right now, then this negotiation could lead somewhere. If it's just a delay tactic, we're going to see more demands and more unrealistic demands. Then yeah, unfortunately, the war will go on for some time.
What do you think Trump's response is going to be to that? What sort of, you could say that he's sort of dipped between the two sides, hasn't he? Do we have any ideas or expectations of how he might react this time?
I have, to be honest, I've been watching this closely, his reaction, and I can tell you, first and foremost, all negotiations are about his emotional reaction to the result of those negotiations. So both Russia and Ukraine, in a sense, are trying to make sure that whenever he's dissatisfied, it's aimed at somebody else rather than them. But once again, there's another worrying trend there that Trump finds it easier to put pressure on Ukraine rather than Russia. And therefore, the result of these negotiations might be, the lack of an agreement. And obviously, both parties are going to try and show that they were reasonable during negotiations. And it's the other side that kind of caused the lack of agreement. But I think at the end of the day, if there's no agreement, sooner or later, Trump will turn on Ukraine again.
And how did you think that the talks between Zelensky and Trump went yesterday? Do we have any indications of what was discussed?
I would say that in terms of emotion and the atmosphere in the room, it was one of the best conversations. In terms of the results, yes, we have these negotiations in Abu Dhabi today, but they weren't actually suggested or agreed upon yesterday. It's a long process. So nothing solid, no results have come out per se out of that bilateral meeting yesterday. But as far as the general dynamic of things is concerned, because Trump is about his emotions first and foremost, I would say it was a good meeting.
And how do you think Zelensky's feeling, especially if we've got Russia saying, there's this one issue about territorial concessions? Do you think that he's concerned of, standing his ground to what Russia is saying, but how Trump may perceive that as, not trying to make progress with peace negotiations? Do you think there's that sort of concern there?
Well, there are many concerns. That's not the only concern that we have. But at the end of the day, like, if we disregard, the emotion, the media coverage, and the tactics that go into this, at the end of the day, it's a question of whether the United States and our allies in the West can put enough pressure on the table in front of Putin to get him to agree to end this war. If he sees weakness, if he detects weakness, the war will continue, and he will continue to try and play those blame tactics and delay tactics. And then sooner or later, Trump will turn on Ukraine again. More people will die, and then back to square one. So it's those two scenarios. Neither one is good for Ukraine, but we're playing the cards that we dealt because we're fighting for our survival.
And I want to turn to Zelensky's speech at Davos yesterday. And he sort of likened coming back to the World Economic Forum to the film Groundhog Day. And he reminded his audience that last year he said that Europe needs to know how to defend itself. But a year on, nothing's changed, in his words. What did you make of his speech? Because many are regarding it as quite critical of his European allies.
Well, it was definitely not an ordinary speech per se. So it wasn't the speech just for the sake of protocol or diplomacy. It was the genuine sentiment that's actually shared by the Ukrainians. Because, let me remind you, some apartments in Kiev have been sitting in sub-freezing temperatures without heat or electricity for nearly, 20 days now, something like that. I've lost track of this. Yes, we're surviving, but at the same time, is Europe doing enough? No. Is the United States doing enough? No. Is the United Kingdom doing enough? No. We're incredibly grateful on one hand for what's been done, but one cannot help but ask, what's the final result? Do we want this to drag along and see where it leads, or do we want to stop Russia? Because if we want to stop Russia, if we want to remove the danger that hangs over Europe at least, although I do disagree with President Trump, I think, the beautiful ocean between, the two continents is not enough to deter Putin if he really wants to mess with the United States. Well, are we doing enough towards that end? The answer is no, and I think President Zelensky was quite clear about it. Furthermore, the certain kind of sentiment statements and actions that we've seen from certain members of the European Union, who shall not be named, are pro-Russian in their nature. Now, that first and foremost destroys the unity of Europe. And President Zelensky has just taken the lead on that. Somebody had to.
And you could argue that with Zelensky's speech yesterday, he sort of skirted around any criticism of the US. But I wanted to hear your thoughts about Trump's recent rhetoric on Greenland, as well as inviting Putin to join his board of peace. Some have argued that Trump's recent actions sort of give off the image of instability with NATO and the US's NATO allies to countries like China, to Russia. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as far as NATO is concerned, when I first said that I'm not so certain that Article 5 is set in stone, I think that was like 2.5, 3 years ago, people laughed at me. Now I wouldn't say that NATO is set in stone. With a highly emotional and unpredictable agent of chaos leading the United States, anything could be on the table like in an hour's time. So even the dismemberment of institutions, whether intentional or unintentional. So it's a very dangerous situation for the stability of the yesteryear. But I think it's a process that sooner or later would have to go through anyway, because the world is changing. Now, as far as Greenland is concerned, once again, nothing is black and white in this world. So on one hand, I fully disagree with how it's been done. But what I do agree with is that under no circumstances control over Greenland, whether it is direct control, military control, or indirect soft power and hybrid tactical control, should fall into Russia or China's hands. That's a given because I think everyone overestimates the strength and how protected the United States are against China and Russia, because everyone is trying to assess it in accordance with the laws of yesterday's war. Now, if we talk about hybrid war, I would argue that the U.S. can be damaged from the inside by using malignant tactics, foreign actors, corruption, new technologies such as FPV drones, for example. So the chaos can come eventually, and no oceans can stop that. So I would say that disagreeing with the tactics, but the fact that we need to kind of look at the world more realistically, that's a given if we want to survive.
But then, it makes me question about Trump's invitation to Putin for the Board of Peace. And I spoke to Robert Fox yesterday, and he's a defense editor for The Standard. And he was suggesting that this is potentially going to give Putin more leverage. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the Board of Peace is a very interesting organization because for, the world to act and deliberate as one, representation is key. And, at the moment, most of the countries representing the Board of Peace are dubious, to say the least. And we even had this internal joke running around in the Kiev that, the real reason Trump is worried about Greenland is to prevent other members of Board of Peace invading it at some point. So, I think that organization is Trump's child. He loves setting those up. He loves the grandeur. He loves, the somewhat infantile maximalist approach. Is it going to work as it is right now? I doubt it. But once again, if there's progress on Ukraine's peace, then probably, some functions could be given to the Board of Peace, and they can migrate there from elsewhere.
For example, the UK, they declined to attend the signing ceremony yesterday for this Board of Peace because they disagreed with Putin's potential involvement with this Board of Peace. But I mean, what sort of approach do you think that European allies to the US, to Ukraine, what sort of approach should they be taking, both in terms of, against Russia, but also towards the US now?
I've been persistently and constantly saying it over the years. Europe needs to unite. Europe needs to realize that, the foundations, institutions, and the ways of yesterday are no longer applicable to the realistic situation. I think Europe needs to rethink its military strategy. So Europe needs to be able to protect itself to a certain degree at least, and not rely on the United States, because the US is a democracy. They can elect a new president who doesn't want to defend Europe, and that's the end of that story. They might elect the president who doesn't want to be part of the World Health Organization or NATO, and that's the end of that story. And, obviously, you can express deep concern as much as you want, but when the Russian tanks start rolling, it won't be the tanks; it will be the drones and the missiles, and men without insignia from within. Then, unfortunately, you'd have to accept that just because it's preposterous that the institutions of yesterday are no longer working, you need the physical safety, and therefore you need an army. You need to unify and be able to defend yourselves from both direct threats and, more importantly, hybrid threats. Secondly, hybrid war extends far beyond the field of battle. It's a war for the minds. It's a war for the pockets and the fridges and TVs. And you need to figure out the way to deal with it. And once again, none of that is accounted for in what the EU is now, and even how more progressive, in my view, the United Kingdom is approaching things right now. So we just need to wake up and accept reality before it's too late. That's the most important thing, because I keep one last thing I can tell you. I keep telling people, like, look, if you look at NATO, if you look at the United Nations, if you look at the international law as it was in 2021, I don't see how we ended up in a situation where I have missiles flying overhead in the European capital 5 years later. So, but that's reality, and like we can be ashamed, we can show disgust, we can criticize as much as we like, but the missiles keep flying. So, it's whether we want to survive it or not. It's come to that point right now. So I applaud the United Kingdom for the sentiment, but just resisting being on a peace board or whatever with Belarus and Russia and the rest is one thing, and being proactive about your security of your allies, and ensuring stable security for the years to come takes a bit more than that. And that was President Zelensky's main sentiment yesterday.
Well, Igor, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
No problem.